Hey, it's Tali, here to tell you about the podcast Israel Story. Now, more than ever, Israel is a tough topic. Some love it, others hate it, but Israel Story offers a nuanced, faithful window into the extraordinary stories of everyday people in Israel. Beautiful and ugly, tragic and inspiring, ridiculous and heartwarming. Check out hundreds of timeless episodes in their back catalog, or dive into the 65 Wartime Diaries episodes capturing slivers of life right now. Hear voices from soldiers to survivors, farmers to rabbis, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and connect with this complicated, amazing place. Hosted by Mishi Harman and produced with the Jerusalem Foundation and the Times of Israel, find Israel Story wherever you get your podcasts.
In need of a good read or just want to keep up with the books everyone's talking about? NPR's Book of the Day podcast gives you today's very best writing in a pocket-sized show. Whether you're looking to engage with the big questions of our times or temporarily escape from them, we've got an author who'll speak to you. Catch today's great books in 15 minutes or less on the Book of the Day podcast, only from NPR.
Welcome to the 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Every week I ask Jewish authors about 5 books in 5 categories. We'll hear about 2 Jewish books that have impacted the author's Jewish identity. We'll hear about 1 book, not necessarily Jewish, that they think everyone should read, a book that changed their worldview. We'll get a peek into what book the author is reading now, and we'll get to hear about the new book they've just published and how it came about. Today we'll be talking with Samantha Greene Woodruff about her new novel, The Trade-Off. The Trade-Off is the story of a brilliant and ambitious young woman striving to find her place on Wall Street in the 1920s. Bea Abramovitz has a gift for math and numbers and for finding patterns within the stock market. But in the 1920s, in a Lower East Side tenement, opportunities for women, and Jewish women, on Wall Street don't just come knocking. It's easier for her golden boy twin brother Jake, who longs to reclaim all their parents have lost after fleeing pogroms in Russia, to come to America. Jake has a charm that can carry him only so far on Wall Street, so Bea devises a plan to be the brains behind her brother, acting as a broker. As Jake's reputation, his heedless ego, and the family fortune soar, Bea foresees catastrophe, an impending crash that could destroy everything if she doesn't finally take control. Samantha Greene Woodruff has an MBA from NYU Stern School of Business and spent 15 years at Viacom's Nickelodeon before leaving to parent her 2 young children. Her first novel, The Lobotomist's Wife, was a #1 Amazon bestseller and Amazon First Reads pick. The Trade-Off is her second novel. Samantha will tell us about the thorny religious legacy of mothers and daughters in her family.
So my mom was kind of the rebel of the family. I was raised even almost less than a secular Jew. Somebody called me a Christmas tree Jew.
She'll share what it meant to her to step into her Jewish identity post 10/7.
I appeared on a blacklist. And at that point, I hadn't been that outspoken. I thought I could kind of pass and hide.
And she'll tell us about her complicated feelings toward wealth.
People on Wall Street are so reviled for being rich. And my feeling is it's never that simple.
That's all coming up next. Hi, Sam. Thank you so much for joining us today on the 5 Books. I'm happy to talk to you.
Hi, Tali. Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I loved reading The Trade-Off. This is like exactly the kind of book I love. I love historical fiction. I love a character you're just rooting for the whole time. She was so much fun. She's someone I wanted to hang out with after the book ended. Oh. I loved reading it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's so nice.
Yeah. I know that there was a real life woman behind some of that.
It wasn't a real life woman. It was a man. And there's a man named Jesse Livermore who was very famous. He still is a very famous investor in the stock world. I had never heard of him. But basically, he short sold the crash of 29, which short sell that. If you read my book, you'll understand short selling without having to like finance. Because I don't like finance, even though I have an MBA and wrote a book and stuff that takes place in the stock market. But Jesse Livermore short sold the crash and made like $100 million in that time's money. And when I found out that that was possible, I said, wow, I would love to write about somebody who is invested in the market and bets against what everyone else thinks is happening. And at first I thought I would write about Livermore. And then the more research I did, he was kind of a scoundrel by the time the market was crashing. And Wall Street was super unregulated, and the men in power were colluding to make the market move the way they wanted it to move until they couldn't when it crashed. So I invented my own investor, and I wanted that investor to have a reason beyond greed for wanting to work on Wall Street. And I also wanted that person to be empathetic, and I like to write about strong women. So from Jesse Livermore's story, I invented Bea Abramovitz. And then the rest of the story is, well, there's also, her parents are based on my great-grandparents a little bit, what I know of them. But that's it. So that's the like truth behind the fiction.
So how did you come to make it a Jewish character?
So I really wanted her to have a complex relationship with money, but one where she was attracted to the markets for some reason. And so really I started to think about like, because people on Wall Street are so reviled for being rich and getting rich in a way that people find kind of anathema. And my feeling is it's never that simple. It's never that black and white. If you're rich from finance, that doesn't make you bad. And if you're poor and you're not in finance, that doesn't make you good. So I was trying to get to a place where I could mine that gray area and that complexity. And my own grandmother, her mother, immigrated to the States and had been almost aristocratically wealthy and then lost everything. And so that seed, to me, felt like a great foundation for Bea's own family journey and for her own purpose for wanting to be on Wall Street and her brother's purpose for wanting to get rich. And it stood to reason, since it was my family, that she would be Jewish. It was an afterthought initially, but then when I started doing research and I discovered how much anti-Semitism there was in the 1920s on Wall Street, then that became like a central tenet of the book. And I really brought in a lot more Judaism. I brought in high holidays. I really made that a much bigger piece of who Bea was. And this was all before last year and before it felt so important to speak out about anti-Semitism.
That's great. I'm fascinated that story was your great-grandmother's story. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about your family background and your kind of Jewish upbringing.
Sure. So I actually have an essay in an anthology that just is coming out in paperback on November 1st and has been out for this past month, called On Being Jewish Now. And I wrote an essay called Jew-ish, with the ish in quotation marks, because I was raised even almost less than a secular Jew. Both of my parents are Jewish, but interestingly, and I'll start with my grandma Pauline, in the book, Bea's mother is Pauline, but it's actually Pauline's mother in my family history who behaved the way and had the story that Pauline in my book does. Pauline's mother, the real Pauline, was aristocratically wealthy, like really, really rich, and left everything behind and apparently never recovered. And she had several sons and one daughter, the daughter being my grandma Pauline. And Pauline was basically treated like her servant because she didn't have one anymore. She didn't adapt to life in America. She didn't, I have some of those themes like running through the beginning of the book. Like at one point I talk about like, she wasn't she'd never lived in the shtetl. She didn't know how to do any of these things. Like she had someone do all these things for her. And so she made those things be her daughter. The interesting thread there is that my grandmother, Pauline, and my grandfather took that relationship with wealth, and he had similar stuff in his own family, and they went to almost a place of communism because they had felt so deeply the disparity of money, of wealth. And so they took it to that place. So my father was bar mitzvahed, but he read a transliterated Haftorah because he didn't really go to Hebrew school. on my mom's side, her parents were essentially modern Orthodox, but they lived in Baltimore, which meant they could eat crabs if they ate them outside. So my mom was kind of the rebel of the family. And when she finally left the nest, she rejected a lot of the traditional trappings of Judaism. So I grew up, somebody called me a Christmas tree Jew. I grew up with a Christmas tree, both, and my dad married a Catholic. So I grew up with a Christmas tree at my dad's house and my mom's house. My parents are divorced. I did get bat mitzvahed, and I mostly got bat mitzvahed because my mother's mother was the modern Orthodox-ish, maybe very, very conservative to modern Orthodox. She and my mom would fight about the fact that it was disgusting and disgraceful that I wasn't having a Jewish education. And so I said, fine, I'll go to Hebrew school. And I went to Hebrew school and I got bat mitzvahed. But from there, you can imagine with the parents that I had and the upbringing that I had, I was a very secular Jew. When I had my own children, I'm a mixed marriage myself. I had my own children. We kind of honor the traditions of Judaism, but they've only been to temple when they've gone to their friends' bar and bat mitzvahs and other family things. And I feel like I've come back around to my Judaism really almost since October 7th. I think that it was a moment when you had to re-examine what it meant to be Jewish. And I've realized how important it is to my life. I'm not a religious Jew, but my secular Jewish identity is very important to me.
Yeah, I did read your essay in Zibby Owen's collection there.
Oh, thank you.
And it struck me that, I think there's this idea that you're defining yourself like sort of opposed to I'm Jewish, but I'm not religious, as the fact that like just being Jewish kind of isn't enough. You have to sort of, I just find that such an interesting, it's your identity. It just is.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting hearing you talk, just all the sort of mothers and daughters and finding the piece that you're going to sort of not necessarily rebel, but live in a different way than the mother did. And I think there's some of that kind of tension in the book also with mothers and daughters.
For sure. Yeah. And that probably was more modeled on my own mother and her mother than my grandmother, Pauline, and her mother, because I never knew Pauline's mother. I never knew my great-grandmother. I just always heard that Pauline had a complex relationship with wealth and money and also men in some ways because she was essentially the servant to her brothers and her mother.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
Yeah, that would make things hard.
Yeah, that would make things hard.
On Death, Sex, and Money, we feature interviews with you, our community of listeners, getting honest about uncomfortable things.
I developed an illness where it isn't safe for me to drive. A friend once said to me, sex is like air. You don't think about it until you're not getting enough. This is a similar sort of thing if you just replace sex with driving.
Listen to Death, Sex, and Money wherever you get podcasts.
Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood, The Diary of Anne Frank.
So I read it in school, I think in grade school, maybe early middle school, but in those kinds of years. But for Anne Frank, I think the Holocaust was something, and I went to Fieldston, which is an ethical culture school, so there was a lot of teachings about ethics and humanity and society. And I feel like the Holocaust was heavily emphasized when I was young, but in a way that was very abstract. So it almost became an eye roll. It was like there was no humanizing to the story until I read Anne Frank. And so, when I picked that book for this, I was like, it's a little trite, but it's true for me to hear the words and feel the experiences of this young girl and the hope and the fear and all the pieces that it was. It brought something real, and I think that's what great books can do. It brings a feeling that you can't conjure on your own into your sphere.
Yeah.
And so that's why I picked that one.
And was the Holocaust something you were aware of outside of school? Was it something that was talked about in your family, or do you remember?
It was in broad strokes, but not. I don't have survivors in my family.
And you talked about in school how it was kind of presented as a moral, ethical lesson. And that's part of the conversation, I think, a lot around the Diary of Anne Frank is how it's presented, if it's a universal story, if it's a Jewish story.
Right.
Is that something that you were thinking about, or just in reflecting on it, did you kind of understand it at the time as a Jewish story?
I think I understood it as a Jewish story, but not in a way that was like banging you over the head with the fact that it was a Jewish story, right? It was a story of a family that was beyond oppressed. I mean, ultimately killed for being Jewish. And I think even then, probably if I think back to it and you're asking me, I mean, I'm 50, so you're asking me to plumb way back into the depths of my memory. But I think probably the ethical culture philosophy was much more, let's look at this as a cautionary tale about humanity. Like I remember we also in that time watched, there was an after school special called The Wave, where they gave, you've seen it?
Yes,
right? I think,
we are about the same age, yeah.
Yeah. So like it was in that same moment of like, how can The Wave, for people who have not seen it or are not our age, they basically, it was a total like 80s after school special. They break the kids into two groups and give them different armbands. And then they kind of say one group with the one armband is good and the other is not. And it turns into this like unbelievable hatred and persecution for those with like the armbands that are in some way considered lesser or told that they're lesser. So yes, I think it was much more in that frame than it was just as a Jewish story.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting just to me is when I was a kid, the Holocaust survivors that I know were, many of my friends' grandparents, and they seemed so old. It felt like something that had happened, ages ago. Now, when I look back on how small that window is between when we were born and when this happened is pretty incredible. And, there was a children's book recently, Martin Luther King and Anne Frank were born in the same year, 1929. So they were the same age. And Barbara Walters was the same age. You could very well imagine an Anne Frank still being alive today.
Yeah, no. And I think especially in moments like we're in right now, that we need those connections to something that grounds it in a universal experience, something that feels real, that feels like, wow, like this isn't ancient history and it's not some fable. Like this is something that happened like not that long ago. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. Have your own children read The Diary of Anne Frank?
I think they've read Night, which seems to be what they're reading around that age more often.
Yeah. Are those conversations that you're having at home with them?
Yes, especially in the last year, because my husband is not Jewish and I am, and I've explained to them that they're Jewish in Jewish law. They're Jewish. And, it's really important to understand what that means and to connect with that. And I'm one of those parents who probably treats my kids too much like adults sometimes. I mean, not in that I tell them like horrible things, but that like I talk politics with them and I talk about these things. And so, yes, so I have talked about it with them for sure.
Yeah. I think my kids, the principal said last year, like war is not age appropriate. And when that's what's going on around you and you have to talk about it, it's not going to be age appropriate. And it is part of their world and part of their upbringing at this point.
Yeah. And it's like, I don't want to scare them, but on the other hand, I want them to understand that this isn't in a galaxy far, far away. There was a period, and it seems to have calmed a little bit, where there were all these blacklists going around of either authors who supported Israel, authors who were Jewish, authors who were anti-Palestine. There was this whole thing, and I appeared on a blacklist. And at that point, I hadn't been that outspoken. But it was that was almost the most galvanizing thing for me to say, like, here we are again.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood. Everything is Illuminated by Jonathan Safran Foer.
The basic story in Everything is Illuminated is that there's this like sort of quirky guy who's a collector who goes back to the Ukraine to find this woman who supposedly saved his grandfather from, there was a town in the Ukraine that was completely obliterated by Nazis. And so he goes back to find this woman who saved his grandfather from that obliteration. But it's very sort of obtuse and literary and very funny. But at the heart of it, there's this humor and there's all this abstractness. And I think what I loved about the book then was the artistry of the writing and the way that the story was constructed, but also that within that there was this core of a story that, again, was about this really horrible thing that happened during the Holocaust to a town of Jews, to a shtetl. And, I think my orientation has always been that I like things that are a little more subtle. And this was that. The core of the story was this incident, but there's so much about the world and the generations and all of that came afterwards.
Yeah, and I think also, this story has the 3 different timelines, right? It has the timeline going back to, I think, the early 1800s or somewhere around then, and then the war story, and then the present day story. And I think that sort of connection to what happened before also places it in the context of a longer history. I'm just curious, given that your great-grandmother was from a prominent or wealthy family, do you know more about your family history because of her family?
I don't, and I wish I did. But she, unfortunately, my grandma Pauline, who I remember so fondly, but she passed away when I was really young. She passed away when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old. When I sat down to write this book, I was like, damn, I wish there was someone I could really interview and get all this information. Even when I talk about my ancestry, I don't know exactly where we were from. It's like Russia or Poland, somewhere, depending where the border was, which sucks.
That's the nature of generational trauma, right? Is that we don't have access to knowing many generations back. And I think that to me was something in Everything is Illuminated that struck me.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. That is a big piece of it. I mean, if you keep going down that line, the theme of this person who is a collector as he's trying to recreate a history that he doesn't really have or understand, it's sort of fascinating and really brilliant.
Yeah, and I think Jonathan Safran Foer said he had gone on a similar trip to Ukraine to find his history, and what he ended up finding was pretty much nothing. And so the book was writing about that absence.
Yes.
I think that's such an interesting way of framing it. Yeah.
Yeah, completely.
Book 3, a book that changed your worldview. The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon.
There are those books that there's something about the book, whether you remember any of the details or not, that just stays with you, that just makes you smile and it was a book you really loved. I think there's a theme here that I like Jewish stories that have some element of Holocaust history in them, but are not about the Holocaust. And Cavalier and Clay it's such a clever and interesting novel. It's an interesting story. And, you're not just learning about what it is to be a Jew who's just come to the U.S. after the Holocaust. It's not just about that. It's also about the comic book industry. And there was all sorts of things I didn't know about comic books. They also have this whole thing with a golem, and I never knew what a golem was before this. But I feel like out of nowhere, I learned so many different things through this novel that, that tells a story of these 2 Jewish young men who create this famous comic book hero. And even the idea that comic book heroes were born out of the desperate need for heroes during World War II. I mean, I don't know. There was so much about it. Just a rich story.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, The Paris Novel by Ruth Reichel and The Whispers by Ashley Audrain.
I'm listening to Ruth Reichel's The Paris Novel, which is I'm loving the story so far. And I'm also reading, I'm almost done with, this is a total left turn from everything we've been talking about, The Whispers by Ashley Audrain. I thought I was going to be done with it before we did this interview, but I haven't had that much time to read. And I'm reading that one because I'm going to attempt to take a bit of a diversion in my third book. I had 2 ideas. One of them is a very intense historical, and then the other one is to do a lighter suspense thriller set where I live, which is Greenwich, Connecticut. So there's a lot of fun, ripe social satire fodder. So I'm reading that one as research to kind of see how someone does that kind of book for craft. And then for pleasure, I'm listening to the Paris novel.
Book 5, the author's latest novel, The Trade-Off by Samantha Greene Woodruff. I'm curious, we've touched on your family history, but did writing about money as a subject feel fraught to you?
So my husband is a hedge fund guy. And the real way I got into this story was that there was an event in very modern Wall Street called the GameStop short squeeze. And it happened in the beginning of the year in 2021. And essentially, there was a very prominent hedge fund guy who happens to be Jewish and is very outspoken, who was short the stock of the company GameStop. And it was this just confluence of events that there was a regular old guy who was furloughed from his work because of COVID, who was home and started investing. And he decided that the big money thought that GameStop was going to fail or go down, and he was going to bet against that. And he basically became like a Pied Piper, rallying all of these small individual investors to bet on GameStop, and they drove the price of the stock up. And basically what happens when you're short a stock is you borrow it at one price and you're betting you're going to be able to buy it back at another price. And so if the price goes up instead of coming down, then that spread is what you're responsible for. However much it goes up based on versus what you think it's going to be at the bottom, that's the squeeze. So the hedge fund guy, was not only financially really put in a bad position, and the whole market went bananas actually, because it was so big, but he was getting death threats, and daily there were memes about, deriding him. And that was the moment when I started thinking about wealth in a more complex way, because I've always had a conflicted relationship with wealth. I did not grow up with a lot of money. I've always been kind of the scrappy person who builds the IKEA furniture and changes every light bulb. But my husband, in the time that we've been married, has been very successful. And that has been something that I have grappled with my whole life. And then watching what happened in GameStop and seeing how this person, who is a lovely human being, was being reviled and his life was being torn apart simply because he was, and I didn't write The Trade-Off as an apology for him, but I wanted to explore it. I just wanted to think about it more. And so I think that what I didn't expect was how incensed I would be, honestly, less about wealth and more about women. I mean, there was so much, Bea's struggle was so frustrating to me. And I think, it helped because then you feel better when she's wealthy. But, I did have a moment too, because I'm writing about the crash. The whole country was decimated when the market crashed. So it was a little fraught to think about how, what happens if you're lucky enough not to do that? And is it okay if anyone doesn't do that? And, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think for Bea, and, you see even with her father has a grocery cart.
Yeah.
Right. And then a grocery store.
Yep.
There's the immigrant story where wealth is really just tied in some ways to security, to success, to assimilation, to fitting in, all of those things.
Yes.
So much more.
To being part. Yes, exactly. To being really part of America and, seizing the American dream. And it is one of the things about the 1920s that was so fascinating, because until the crash, it was also in some ways the most egalitarian moment in wealth and investing that the country had ever seen. The average guy was able to buy a stock, which had never happened before. It's also what created the crash, because they could buy it on, it's sort of similarly with the housing crisis in 2008, there were people that were borrowing so much money to buy things that when they had to pay them back, they had no money to pay it back.
And you say the average guy, and it was the average guy. And that the women's departments that you describe, where it was these, wealthy upper class women who were catering to other women, that was something I'd never known about. That was so interesting.
I didn't know about it either. And there's very little history about women on Wall Street in those early days. I found 3 books, and one of them was a history from the 1950s of the National Association of Bank Women, which was formed in the 20s. And it was their history written by them. Like it wasn't even really a history book. It was more of like a primary source document. But yes, and the thing about the women's departments is that was not egalitarian. That was staffed by rich women who had connections, who therefore were most likely not Jewish, and catering only to other rich women who had the disposable income to be investing in significant ways. There was something else going on in the 20s where there were kind of more regular Joe women who were stock brokers in that they would sell stocks. But these were people who were either doing like phone calls when it was available, or they were out in small towns and in suburbs knocking on doors like a vacuum cleaner salesman, except they were selling shares of stocks. So it was very different than the more complex, sophisticated investor mentality of the actual sort of center of things in Wall Street.
Yeah. I mean, I think you did a really masterful job in creating that sense of frustration about how far, or the limitations of how far Bea could actually advance before she just, hit many walls. And I was struck by the fact that even the 2 men who sort of knew her the best, which were her brother and then her soon-to-be fiance, boyfriend, etc., even they didn't really fully see her, right? Even they had their limitations on how much they could appreciate what she was capable of.
Yes. And I think that, it makes me, because I'm an introspective person, it makes me look at my own life and see, is there a parallel? Because I had the same kind of character in my first novel, in The Lobotomist's Wife. Some of that is a reflection of the times. And so what I like to try and do is take that combination, the reflection of the time, with what is in some ways a universal and never-ending struggle for women to be seen as people, capable people, and not women. That gets my goat, and I do kind of like dig in on that in every book. So even people that you really like, characters that you really like, if they were male, they didn't necessarily see Bea for who she was. I like that tension on some level. Like hate, that tension. Mm-hmm. I like to write about it.
What do you think Bea would make of women in Wall Street today?
I think that she would probably feel that women have come a long way from where she was, but not far enough. When you start publicizing a book, you do a lot, like you write articles and pieces and stuff. And I've really been trying to look for enough statistical data on women on Wall Street over time to write a piece about this. But there are a lot more women on Wall Street now, certainly, than there were when Bea was on Wall Street. But if you think about the fact that Janet Yellen, who was the first female president of the Fed, did not become president of the Fed until 2014. That's 10 years ago. The first woman who was able to get a seat on the trading floor was a woman named Uriel Siebert in 1967. So I think it's a slow progress. And even now, like at the C-suite level and at the super executive level, unless it's in something that's not totally financed, there's not a lot of women in the business world. There are a lot getting hired in as investment banking analysts and things, but I think it's still hard as a woman to really make it in finance.
Yeah. And I think the fact that you created her, even when you see her as a young woman and she has this passion for the patterns and numbers, and it's still an unusual kind of characteristic to read about or see represented for a girl or a young woman to have those kinds of big interests.
Right.
Yeah.
For sure. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, look, my sister-in-law, I worked in business strategy and I kind of scooted around, but I did things where there were a lot more women. My sister-in-law went to business school and then did like an investment banking program for 2 years. And throughout her business school career, she was considered a diversity hire. She got an internship as a diversity hire. She got a job as a diversity hire. And she's, a white, affluent woman. She's just, and she's not Jewish. She just happens to be female. And that was her diversity. So.
Yes, 50% diversity.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hope that anyone who hasn't read the book yet will read the book. It's fun to be in their world. It's really fun to see a woman be successful and prove everybody wrong. I love that part of it. So thank you very much for sharing your story. I wanted to pick up, if you don't mind, just a little more about having this story out at this time. You talked a little bit earlier about these blacklists that have gone on and stepping up into your own Jewish identity a little more publicly and vocally. What was it like for you to be on one of those lists?
So the funny thing about appearing on that list, and that was before this book came out, and my first book, The Lobotomist's Wife, is not Jewish at all. I mean, in fact, in my mind, my protagonist was Jewish, but it's an afterthought. It's not the main concept. And Judaism is I don't know if it's discussed once in the whole book. But at the end of the day, when I appeared on this blacklist, it was before The Trade-Off came out, which is a very Jewish book. And it was apparently because I had posted on October 8th, maybe, of last year, an Israeli flag on my social media. And I didn't take a huge stand, but to me, the severity of the act of terrorism was it seemed at that moment when I posted it, I didn't think anybody would ever think that was political. It was just our hearts go out to this country whose people have been attacked because they're Jewish by terrorists. And that, because if the particular blacklist I appeared on, which was one of these crazy ones, because it was some college student or grad student who had 200 followers, but then it went viral and 7 million people looked at it was a spreadsheet. It was a Google Doc spreadsheet. And so it had notes about why people were classified in different categories. Leading up to that, and that was a couple months probably after October 7th, I was very scared and very careful about how much I said publicly and about even identifying myself as Jewish. So until I appeared on a list, I thought I could kind of pass and hide. And, my last name is Woodruff and my husband is a WASP and I live in Greenwich, Connecticut. And I mean, you would probably know the minute you start talking to me because I don't hide it ever personally. But once I was on that list, first I realized how scared I had been. And I also realized that there was no hiding. And so then I could be as outspoken as I wanted. And I still don't feel, even to this day, that I have any knowledge base or authority to be a true activist on this subject. But I do think it is important to own my Jewish identity everywhere that I can. And additionally, I'm thrilled that I wrote a book that turns out to be so Jewish in this moment. Whereas before I might have said, "Ooh, it's too Jewish." Now I feel the opposite. And I remember when I handed the manuscript in and I put in at the end of my author's notes something about a wish for a world where everybody can be recognized and, anti-Semitism and all forms of prejudice can be a thing of the past, and being a tiny bit nervous when I did it. And now I'm God, I wish I had written a treatise on that in the back of my book.
Absolutely. No, it's really beautiful and moving to hear you talk about it, especially in the context of all these other stories and all these, time periods where it didn't matter what you felt about your own Jewish identity. It really just mattered what other people felt about you. So then to step into it and own it as it being your own it's really moving.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was great.
Thank you. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 books. Our guest today was Samantha Greene Woodruff, talking about her delightful new book of historical fiction, The Trade-Off. You can find a link to the book in our show notes. If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to subscribe and share with friends and family. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Dina Friedman. A special thank you to the Jewish Book Council.